There's something that happens the first time someone uses cannabis, and almost no one can describe it exactly. It's not the laughter, nor the relaxation, nor that supposed feeling of expansion that everyone talks about. It's something much stranger, like a small crack appearing in the reality you've always taken for granted. For a moment, your perception stops working on autopilot, and suddenly, that silent observer who was always behind your thoughts, but whom you never noticed, becomes evident. And before your mind dismisses it by saying, of course, it's because of the substance, something much more unsettling happens. A part of you recognizes that what you're seeing doesn't seem like a simple illusion. It's as if the illusion had been the usual way you perceive the world, as if the veil had been pulled back just a few inches, and through that opening, something slipped in that you had never known how to name. That's exactly what Jacobo Greenberg studied for years. Not as a problem of addiction or just a simple curiosity, but as a possible window into understanding how consciousness really works. And what he found doesn't match either the official narrative or the idealized version of those who romanticize these experiences. His proposal was much more precise, quite a bit more uncomfortable, and if you pay attention, it can change the way you understand your own mind, even when there's no substance involved. But before we continue, I want to ask you something very unusual. Don't hit the skip button. Don't look at another tab. Don't reply to a message. Do something much harder. Stay completely still for 3 seconds without doing anything. Just observe the person who is listening to these words right now. If those 3 seconds seemed long to you, you just experienced exactly the problem that Jacobo Greenberg was talking about. We are so used to noise that silence starts to make us uncomfortable. Now go ahead and write awake in the comments. Not for the algorithm. Do it as a conscious decision to get out of autopilot and watch this video with your full attention. Because what comes next could change the way you understand your own mind. Greenberg was a Mexican neuroscientist whose career began in mainstream science and ended up exploring a territory that academia still doesn't quite know how to classify. He studied psychophysiology. He founded a brain research laboratory at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and published dozens of scientific papers. But while most people studied only the brain, he decided to investigate altered states of consciousness, shamanism, and psychic phenomena. That path eventually led him to develop the concept of the synergetic space, an idea that distanced him from traditional science and at the same time made him a reference point for those who seek to understand consciousness from another perspective. In December 1994, he disappeared without a trace. To this day, no one has been able to explain with certainty what happened. But beyond the mystery, he left behind a body of work that continues to raise questions decades later. And that's exactly what we're going to explore. Not his entire theory, but a very specific question. What did Greenberg discover about what happens in consciousness when a person uses cannabis? To understand his answer, you first need to understand the paradigm he was working from. Because Greenberg did not believe that the brain produced consciousness. For him, that was one of the greatest limitations of modern neuroscience. His proposal was exactly the opposite. The brain does not generate experience, it decodes it. It acts as a receiver capable of translating information coming from a much broader field, which he called the lattice or the mesh, a fundamental structure that would potentially contain every possible experience. From this perspective, the brain only tunes into a small part of that information, and the quality of that tuning depends on something fundamental, the coherence of the neural field. Remember that idea, as it's the foundation of everything. According to Greenberg, everyday consciousness arises because your neural field maintains a stable configuration, which allows it to tune into certain frequencies of the lattice and build with them. The reality you experience, because that reality is consistent and predictable, you end up believing that's how the world is. But according to him, that was the great confusion. You don't experience the world as it is. You experience the version of the world that your system is able to decode in its usual state. Think about it for a moment. How often have you assumed your perception was reality? How many times have you confused the map with the territory? It's not a flaw. That's how the mind works. The problem arises when that mechanism becomes so automatic that the observer disappears and only the screen remains. This is where one of Greenberg's key concepts comes in, the perceptual mask. He wasn't talking about a lie, but about a natural process. Over time, the mind repeats the same patterns of interpretation until they become more and more rigid. Those filters are useful because they allow you to get by without having to reinterpret everything all the time. But they also come at a cost. They reduce the range of what you're able to perceive. What doesn't pass through those filters stops appearing in your experience, not because it doesn't exist, but because your mind learned to ignore it. And the most curious thing is that this process happens without you noticing. It doesn't cause pain. It creates certainty. You start to believe that you already know how the world works, who you are, and how things are. But that apparent security, when seen up close, looks more like a cage built from everything that already feels familiar to you. That's exactly where the most interesting part of Greenberg's research on cannabis begins. And no, his interest was never in THC, CBD, or the pharmacology that anyone can find on the internet. The real question was something else. What happens to the neural field when this substance enters the system? According to his theory, cannabis doesn't add anything to consciousness. It doesn't create new experiences. What it does is temporarily interfere with the mechanism that holds up that perceptual mask. It doesn't open doors that don't exist. It simply loosens the locks on doors your mind has kept closed for years. Imagine that your consciousness is like a character inside a video game. Cannabis doesn't give it new powers. What it does is cause a glitch in the graphics engine that renders the rules of the environment. And for a few moments, the character can realize that the walls of the game were just decoration. But here's the most important difference. That interruption is not automatically an expansion of consciousness. It can become a revelation or a deeply uncomfortable experience. It all depends on a variable that almost no one mentions: the state of coherence of the neural field and the observer's ability to sustain what appears when the filters begin to loosen. I remember a conversation during a seminar about altered states of consciousness. A woman said that she had used cannabis the night before and had experienced something that left her completely bewildered. She didn't have hallucinations or a panic attack. She simply saw with brutal clarity the enormous distance she felt between herself and the people she loved, as if the screen that normally softened that feeling had disappeared. I asked her if the next day she still believed that it had just been an effect of the substance. She remained silent. Then she replied no, that it had been one of the most real experiences of her life. And she added something even more revealing. The problem wasn't what she had seen, it was that she didn't know what to do with that truth. That is what the Kabbalistic tradition associates with perceptual tzimtzum. When the filters are relaxed, a new reality does not appear. What appears is the space that was always behind them. And that space can feel like a liberation or like an abyss. It all depends on whether the observer is ready to handle it. That woman didn't discover a new fear. She simply stopped hiding one that had always been there. That was exactly what Greenberg observed over and over again. Cannabis doesn't create the experience's content. That content was already within the person's neural field. What the substance does is temporarily reduce the filter that decides what reaches consciousness and what remains hidden. That's why two people can have completely different experiences. Even the same person can experience very different things depending on the moment in their life. And here's a part that almost nobody mentions. Neither those who condemn cannabis nor those who defend it without reservations. Greenberg was talking about patterns of energy capture. It's not a metaphor. It was a phenomenon he identified based on his research on the neural field. It happens when the mind enters a feedback loop and starts confusing its own contents with something coming from the outside. From the inside, it feels like a revelation, like a deep insight, as if you were finally seeing reality as it truly is. But many times the exact opposite happens. The system is not expanding its perception. It is amplifying its own fears, desires, beliefs, and personal stories until they seem like absolute truths. And here is the most important difference in his entire theory. It doesn't matter how intense an experience may seem. What matters is the direction in which the neural field moves. When there is real expansion, the neural field opens up to information it couldn't process before. A sense of contact with something greater than oneself arises. On the other hand, during a capture pattern, all the movement goes inward. The intensity increases, but the breadth disappears. It's like turning up the volume of a single song until you can't hear any others, and that song is usually the same old one. Your fears, your wounds, your unfulfilled desires. That's why two people can use cannabis and believe that both had a spiritual experience. When in reality, one is expanding their perception and the other is just trapped inside an echo of themselves. According to Greenberg, repeated use without a clear intention tends to strengthen those patterns. Why? Because the neural field learns. Every time that internal loop is interpreted as a revelation, the system reinforces it. Over time, the substance stops opening filters and starts activating the same circuit every time. If you've met regular users, you may have noticed it. At first, everything seems new. The conversations are full of discoveries. But over the years, the same topics start to repeat, the same insights, the same conclusions disguised with different words. The neural field is no longer exploring, it's repeating. And cannabis stops being a gateway and becomes a habit. That's not a moral judgment. It's the description of a process that Greenberg said he had observed. Interestingly, many ancient traditions already spoke of something similar. They distinguished the threshold from the dwelling. The threshold is a place of passage. A dwelling is where you choose to live. Extraordinary experiences are meant to be passed through. You learn something and then come back. But when someone tries to stay and live there, they end up trapped in an in-between place, neither fully present nor truly expanded, just disoriented, though couched in very spiritual language. For Greenberg, the neural field needs to alternate between stability and interference in order to learn. If the interference becomes permanent, it loses the reference point that allows it to grow. It's like trying to tune an instrument in a room where the noise never stops. And here we come to another of the most striking topics in his research, the pineal gland. For him, it was not just a hormonal gland. He saw it as an interface between the neural field and the lattice. He observed that the most coherent experiences showed electrical patterns, very similar to those seen during deep meditation. But cannabis did not guarantee that state. Depending on the person's prior level of coherence, it could either facilitate or block it. And that was, once again, the key. not the substance, but the user's inner state when using it. All of this led him to a very clear conclusion. Consciousness has a direction, and that direction can be cultivated. Meditation, contemplation, and sustained presence cultivate that coherence in a lasting way. Cannabis, at best, can only offer a glimpse of that state, and Greenberg never denied the value of that glimpse. What he warned about was something else. A glimpse is not a direction. Seeing the horizon for a few seconds doesn't mean you've learned how to reach it. If that experience isn't integrated into everyday life over time, it stops being a guide and becomes nothing more than nostalgia. And that nostalgia for a state that only seems attainable through a substance is, according to Greenberg, the true origin of perceptual dependence. For him, that was the most important concept, and at the same time, the most overlooked in the whole discussion of substances. He wasn't just talking about chemical or behavioral addiction. He was talking about something deeper, about what happens when the nervous system learns to seek outside itself for the state of coherence it should learn to generate on its own. And when that happens, the cost isn't just physical. The development of one's own consciousness also stops. Think of it through an image from the Kabbalah. The vessels exist to receive the light. But when a vessel has already fulfilled its function, it is not forced to contain more. The light simply continues to a higher level. It's not a punishment. It's the natural way in which growth happens. Each stage needs a new vessel, wider, able to hold what it couldn't before. But if the neural field learns to open only through a substance, those new structures stop developing. The system finds a shortcut. It accesses elevated states for a moment, without building the capacity to sustain them on its own. And when the need to grow disappears, growth simply stops. That's what Grinberg observed in people who turned the altered state into a destination, instead of just a tool along the way. He didn't see any obvious deterioration. He saw something much more subtle, a constant sense of depth. Accompanied by a deep stagnation, the experiences were still intense. But the neural field was no longer developing new forms of coherence. It just repeated the same states over and over again, believing it was still moving forward. And here comes the most important question in all of this. It doesn't matter whether you've ever used cannabis or not. The question remains the same. In what areas of your life are you looking outside for something that can only develop within you? Because that pattern isn't limited to substances. It can also show up in relationships, in success, in money. Even in the constant consumption of spiritual content, the system is not failing. It simply learned to take the easiest path to the feeling that it is growing. But a feeling of growth is not growth. That's why Greenberg spoke of a completely different state. He called it self-generated coherence. A coherence that doesn't depend on external stimuli, but arises from self-generation. Progressive organization of one's own neural field through presence, attention, and the willingness to look at reality without filters. That doesn't mean rejecting external tools. Contemplative traditions have always used plants, rituals, sounds, or teachers. The difference lies in how they are used. When there is self-generated coherence, those tools accelerate a process that was already happening. They don't replace it. They work as a catalyst, not as a replacement. And the difference is noticeable in everyday life. Those with that foundation integrate their experiences. Their way of acting changes. Their presence changes. Their way of facing problems changes. On the other hand, someone who hasn't developed that coherence only accumulates intense experiences. They remember them, but they don't integrate them. And the next search is no longer about growing. It's about feeling the same way again. That's why Greenberg asked a question that was simple yet uncomfortable. After the experience, how do you treat the people around you? Are you more patient? Do you react less out of fear? Can you hold other people's discomfort without rushing to fix it? Are you really more present? Because for him, that was the only valid measure of development, of consciousness, not visions, not great insights, nor the ability to talk about deep topics with sophisticated words. The true measure was the quality of your presence in daily life. And that presence can't be faked. It's evident in how you listen, how you respond, and how you handle everyday conflicts. This ties to another key idea from Greenberg: friction. Every time reality contradicts the image you have of the world, tension arises. And that tension, if there is enough coherence, is precisely what drives growth, because it forces the system to reorganize itself, to become broader. But when cannabis becomes the usual way out without any prior internal coherence, something different happens. The system starts to avoid that friction. It learns that there is a way to escape to a state that feels better without going through the process that actually produces growth. And what the brain learns, it repeats. What it repeats, it automates, until it ends up losing the ability to stay present right in the moments when it could transform the most, in an uncomfortable conversation, when realizing he was wrong, or by holding a difficult emotion without needing to numb it or escape from it. The real friction appears when you simply stay still, without any stimulation, without substances, without distractions. Just you and the real state of your own mind. For Greenberg, that was one of the most important abilities, and also one of the first to weaken when cannabis use was common, and there was no conscious integration. Not because the mind became worse, but because it was developing a growing inability to endure its own silence. And a mind that cannot remain in silence can hardly transform itself, because it is precisely in that silence where the neural field begins to reorganize itself toward higher levels of coherence. Here is the idea that completely changes the usual way of understanding this subject. Most people believe that expanded states of consciousness come from outside. But Greenberg proposed exactly the opposite. Those states are already part of us. It's just that they usually last such a short time that we almost never get to recognize them. They appear right before you fall asleep, in the first seconds after you wake up, when you contemplate nature, and for a moment time seems to stop, when a song takes you to a place that's impossible to explain. Or when, after a completely honest conversation, a silence falls that says much more than any word. In all those moments, the neural field naturally does what a substance tries to bring about artificially. It relaxes the filters, and it allows aspects of reality to appear that normally remain hidden. Greenberg called those moments windows of natural coherence. And the real work is not about replacing them with a chemical experience. It's about learning to recognize them, to prolong them, and make them more and more frequent. Because a substance can reproduce the sensation, but not the internal process that made it possible. And that difference ends up being huge over time. Whoever learns to open those windows from within finds more and more clarity in everyday life. Whoever depends on opening them from the outside discovers that without that stimulus, everything seems more and more empty. Greenberg never claimed that plants had no place in the development of consciousness. That would ignore thousands of years of shamanic tradition that he himself studied and respected. What he said was much more precise. The result depends on the context, the intention, and the internal state of the person. Above all, on their ability to integrate what they've experienced afterward. Without those elements, the experience can end up becoming an energy drain, perceptual dependence, or a reduced ability to face life's friction. With them, the same experience can serve as a true catalyst. And then there's the only question that no one can answer for you. Where is your consciousness really moving towards? Not during an extraordinary experience, but when absolutely nothing is happening, when no one is stimulating you, when there's no music, no screens, no substances. Can you stay with yourself without feeling the need to escape? Because that ability doesn't appear overnight. It's built little by little, learning to stay a little longer in discomfort. Stopping the search outside for what can only grow inside. And maybe that's the last inversion that Greenberg was trying to point out. That tiredness we feel when we're constantly searching for new experiences doesn't mean we need more intensity. Maybe it means exactly the opposite. That the system is exhausted from searching in the wrong direction. It doesn't need more stimulation. It needs space, silence.
Silencio.
Time to reorganize itself. Because consciousness doesn't need to be altered to expand. It just needs us to stop convincing it that it's small.